Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third lesson in American history class. Today's topic is quite the sobering one, and one that it is really important to learn despite, the cruelty and everything involved in this lesson. It is about the Holocaust. It's about Nazi Germany's systematic murder of European Jews. 6 million Jews lost their lives in the Holocaust, along with 5 to 6 million other people as well. And we're going to be talking about them too. But the Holocaust refers the systematic part of that line really speaks to it, because there have been other sorts of genocides throughout history, but this is definitely the one that is probably the most recent and done by a large Western power. So it's very important for us to understand it, because there are still people alive today who went through this, and it's important to understand how these sorts of things happen so we can avoid it in the future. There have been genocides since, especially some famous ones like the one in Rwanda in East Africa, but this is really the one that's the most famous to our imaginations today, and that's because it was perpetrated by a Western power in somewhat modern times. So it's important to remember how these things happen. So let's go for how did this all happen in the first place? Well, it took place over a very, very long period of time before the camps, as it were. So anti-Semitism, what is it? It's a word used to describe discrimination or hostility directed specifically at the Jewish people. The Jewish people, if you've ever heard the word diaspora before, that just refers to people who are taken out of their homeland and spread throughout the world. The Jewish diaspora happened after the Masada incident in the year 70 AD, where the Jewish people rebelled against the Roman Empire, and many Jews were actually sent from what's now modern-day Israel into what is now Eastern Europe. So that's why there were so many Jewish people living in Eastern and Central Europe at the time. Anti-Semitism happened in Germany especially bad. A lot of Germans, especially the Nazis, pinned their problems on the Jews. This is the whole stab in the back conspiracy from the end of World War I, where the idea was if we just held out a little bit longer, Germany could have won World War I, and it was a Jewish conspiracy in the German government at the time to make it so they would lose. So one important thing to remember about the Nazis is that compared to other governments at the time and other governments throughout history, they were really, really big into conspiracy theories, and this was the big one that they ended up kind of defining them as opposed to other political parties at the time. And Hitler said as much in the book Mein Kampf, especially when it came to his hatred of the Jewish people. And many people just didn't take him so seriously, even though he outlined everything that he was planning to do in this book that he wrote in the early 20s. It was only when he really got power, something like 11 years later, that he would show that he wasn't joking, he wasn't kidding around. These kinds of beliefs really did define him and the Nazi Party in general. The kind of common enemy that was created kind of out of thin air with not any evidence that it was the Jews behind all the problems that were happening in Germany, especially when they were so hard hit by the Great Depression, is what kind of united a lot of Germans, regained national pride, and gave them a purpose. So this was the idea of scapegoating. A group of people can actually unite another group. Here are some Nazi policies that were happening. So remember, the Holocaust didn't just happen one day. It was all sort of this fermenting hatred and anti-Semitism over a few decades. In 1933, the Nazis ordered a one-day boycott of businesses owned by Jews. So it just starts with that. Just starts with a one-day boycott of their businesses. Then we have 1935, we have something called the Nuremberg Laws that stripped Jews of their German citizenship, and it outlawed marriage between Jews and non-Jews. This is where a lot of Jewish people started to take this threat seriously. A lot of them escaped to places like the United States, but some didn't think it was going to get as bad as it ended up. A lot of people just didn't take Hitler seriously at his word when he said he was going to do all these things. In 1938, a lot of Jews lost their businesses. Jewish kids were barred from going to school, and Jewish lawyers and doctors were forbidden to serve non-Jews. So how is a Jew actually defined during this time? You can see these two people here who have the Star of David sewed into their clothes. Someone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, regardless of their religion, regardless of their beliefs, were considered Jewish at the time. So Hitler had 2 sorts of kind of police forces to enforce his rules, the anti-Jewish laws that had happened. He had first the Gestapo. These were like the secret police. And then he also had something called the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, and that was the private army of the Nazi Party. Basically, the SS were the ones who ended up guarding the concentration camps, and they were also the ones who would go out, especially on the Eastern Front in World War II, they would go out and actually commit executions of Jews live just in the villages that they came across. Concentration camps are just places where political prisoners are confined. And the camps held not just Jews, but homosexuals as well, and people who followed, who were Jehovah's Witnesses, the Roma people, also known as gypsies, but these are the people, another ethnic group who Hitler despised, and even people who are homeless. And this was all part of the Nazis' idea of, eugenics, of trying to create a more perfect society with genetically better people. Lots of people were also killed during this time and euthanized, ones who had disabilities and things like that. It was a very cruel time. Kristallnacht. This is on November 9th, 1938. A lot of Nazi thugs and, people in the SS and the Gestapo throughout Germany and Austria looted and destroyed Jewish business, stores, houses, and businesses. The Night of the Broken Glass in German. That's why it's called Kristallnacht. You see the picture there. You can see some of the broken glass because they went around and basically destroyed every Jewish business that they could. There's a video here that you could look if you want to. It was about the armed Jewish resistance that happened in many cities, including Warsaw, Poland. But we don't have quite time to go into that right now. But it's important to know that a lot of Jewish people actually did fight back against the Nazis at the cost of their own lives. And then finally we have the final solution. This is where there's actual genocide happening. Genocide is the deliberate destruction of an entire ethnic group or a cultural group. And a lot of what was used to carry this out was a pesticide called Zyklon B. Jews were seen not as humans, but as pests to be destroyed. A lot of kind of the literature at this time, if you look at actual quotes from Hitler and a lot of other people in the Nazi high command at this time, they viewed a lot of they always talked about the Jewish problem, and that's why it's called the final solution. Because it was always the Jewish problem. And the way that Hitler talked about Jewish people is that, he didn't really see them as people at all. He kind of had like a disgust sort of level to make them sound like they were non-human, like the way that you would call like a rat. So this is why him using pesticides is something that's really telling about how they were really thought of. And 2/3 of all European Jews were killed. Eventually, this whole system of camps that existed in Eastern Europe and Germany at the time, they were liberated. A lot of these concentration camps were found out because they weren't really well known. They were found out by either the Red Army coming from the East and the Americans and British coming from the West. And it was a pretty shocking realization to know how bad everything had gotten, and how people were being kind of indiscriminately murdered and in such large numbers. Eventually, a lot of the people in the Nazi high command were put on trial after the war, and they were convicted for crimes against humanity. And 12 out of the 24 officers and the people in the Nazi high command who survived the war received the death sentence. Their defense was that they were just following orders at the time. This is kind of how they wanted to defend themselves. It's like, it wasn't us who did it. We were just following orders from the top of the Nazi command, from Hitler himself. And we now know that as the Nuremberg defense. It's where, I have a picture of it here, it's where people say that they are just following orders. And this is very important because a lot of times you still hear this today in a lot of different contexts where it's like, I'm absolved of personal responsibility for carrying this out because I'm just following the people above me. But what was decided at the Nuremberg trials was that that wasn't a good enough excuse, that wasn't a good enough defense, that if you see such terrible atrocities being committed, that you have a moral obligation to not comply and to stop it, no matter what. So it goes to show that, yeah, we do have personal responsibility for what goes on. And the important thing to remember, too, about the Holocaust is that a lot of people who we would consider ordinary people, police officers and farmers and people, working in factories who are called to be in the German army or called to be in, prison guards and that sort of thing, they ended up perpetrating a lot of these terrible atrocities that happened. And it was ordinary people. It's important to remember that for all of us to stay on guard against these sorts of any sort of hatred that's told us to engage in any sort of hatred. And that's really one of the big lessons of the Holocaust. And this will end up having huge ramifications throughout history, and especially in the 20th century to follow, is what's going to be the world's what are we going to do about the fallout of this event that happened. And so we'll definitely be talking about that more as we go on, especially when it comes to Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel. A lot of it has to do with how horrible the Holocaust ended up being. So it's very important to remember for understanding history and not repeating the mistakes of the past. So thank you all for tuning in and watching. I'll see you some other time.